Movie Nut here with a review for Bram Stoker's Dracula, the 1992 horror film starring Gary Oldman, Winona Ryder, Keanu Reeves, Richard E. Grant, and Anthony Hopkins. The story, based on that of the iconic horror novel by Bram Stoker, follows a young clerk, Jonathan Harker, played by Keanu Reeves, who journeys to the Carpathian Mountains to seal a deal of property with the mysterious Count Dracula. The Count invites him to stay for a while at the castle while they negotiate deals, and eventually Dracula imprisons Harker in the castle, leaving him to the mercy of his vampire brides, and journeys back to England himself, where he starts seducing Harker's wife, Mina, played by Winona Ryder, as well as tormenting Mina's friend Lucy. Eventually, Mina's circle of friends calls in the help of Professor Van Helsing, played by Anthony Hopkins, to investigate what exactly is wrong with Lucy. And so the battle between humans and Dracula begins. The cast here is for the most part rather excellent, with special praise going to Gary Oldman and Anthony Hopkins as Dracula and Van Helsing respectively. Despite this being a relatively early point in Oldman's film career, he pulls off the role as if he's been doing this for years. He's an absolute pro on the screen and pulls off a effective performance. He's never overblown or silly or cartoonish in any way, unlike the Christopher Lee or Bela Lugosi Draculas could be at times, but always has a sense of believability about him. He isn't playing the stereotypical ranting maniac here. He's rather playing someone who's a tortured soul, someone who is upset at the loss of those he loved and feels nothing but hatred towards man. And Anthony Hopkins plays off this wonderfully, playing Van Helsing as somewhat aloof, which is kind of fitting if you're a man who has to battle supernatural demons. The rest of the cast is filled with familiar faces you probably know if you're familiar with 90s films, such as Winona Ryder, who wonderfully plays Mina, Richard E. Grant, who plays one of John and Mina's close friends, as well as Keanu Reeves himself, who plays Harker. Now, undeniably, it should be pretty obvious who is the weak point in the cast. This was relatively early in Keanu Reeves' career. He hadn't yet done Speed, which was the film that cemented him as a somewhat credible actor. At this point, very often, he can't keep his accents consistent, and he comes off just as the pretty boy of the film, something that Coppola himself acknowledged. However, he never gives a genuinely horrific performance. It's not like watching some of the Twilight actors. He pulls it off just convincing enough so that we at least can tolerate him. The visuals are simply spectacular, with special praise going to Eiko Ishioka for the costumes, which look absolutely beautiful, with praise especially going to Dracula's outfit, whether it's him as the pale old man in those flowing red robes, or his younger self as the knight in that extremely strange yet undeniably cool suit of armor. And the film's look perfectly captures the classic image of Gothic horror. You have churches, you have stone staircases, you have horse-drawn carriages, candelabras, castles in the fog, and it all captures that atmosphere wonderfully, especially in the parts set in the Carpathian Mountains, near the beginning and end of the film, which do indeed create the atmosphere of cold isolation that perfectly fits Dracula's character. And the score by perfectly complements the film, capturing both the horror, the romance, and the sense of adventure about it. In fact, one of his tracks was later used in the original trailer for the 1999 version of The Mummy. And furthermore, all of the special effects here were done practically. There is absolutely no CGI. Francis Ford Coppola, the director, deliberately asked that all the film's effects to be done the old school way, using camera tricks and prosthetics. So, props to them for making everything look good, from the makeup of Dracula when he's an old man, to one of his transformations where he transformed into a demonic bat creature, to points when Mina thinks about Dracula and you see his eyes in the clouds. All of that is done practically. No computer trickery here, and that is really, really impressive. And so we move now to the final thing, the script. The film, as its title implies, is a much closer adaptation to the original novel than previous efforts. Most of the previous Dracula films were actually based on the stage play, most famously the 1930 version starring Bela Lugosi and a 1979 version starring Frank Langella. This film for the most part stays extremely faithful to the source material. However, rather than taking things away from it as most adaptations do, it actually adds things to it, most notably giving Dracula's background as him being Vlad Tepes the Impaler, the infamous Romanian warlord notorious for his gory warfare. For the longest time, people have associated Vlad as with Dracula and often say that Bram was inspired by the legends of Vlad to create Dracula. So Coppola decided, you know what, let's finally put that on screen. And it does in fact work very well. You can definitely see how the two really complement each other. Both have an extremely bloody nature, both were very cunning and brutal about getting what they wanted, and both had a fanatical devotion to the things they cared about. However, despite these few tweaks, the film stays true to the novel's core themes about love. You have to remember, this was written back in the Victorian era, a time of extreme morality, where anything sexual was viewed with a very, very questionable eye. This film, much like the novel, is about challenging those conventions, about people wanting to express their love and their lust in an era that openly sees them as being wrong and wicked. And the relationship between Mina and Dracula perfectly exemplifies this. Mina knows that she shouldn't be cheating on her husband, yet she is inexplicably drawn to Dracula. There is a deeper reason for this, however, I'm not going to spoil it. But it does create a very powerful, very moving storyline. Yes, Dracula does a lot of bad things, but he's not doing them because he's a egotistical madman who wants to rule the world. He's doing them because he wants to feel love, which is a very effective way, and it's a great way to look at Dracula as a much deeper, more interesting character. And credit goes to Oldman's performance and Coppola's direction for the effectiveness of that. Really, I have nothing to complain about when it comes to story. It moves at a good pace. There were no logical fallacies or plot holes here, save for one scene where, for whatever reason, there's a rainstorm out in the garden of Mina's house and she and Lucy decide to have a kiss out in the rain, which, frankly, I've never understood the purpose of that. To me, it just seemed like fan service. Coppola knew that there were Winona fanboys in the audience, so he decided to, well, please them. However, that and Keanu's somewhat questionable acting aren't enough to bring down the film. This is a film that works on multiple levels and never forgets its core themes or its ideas, something that unfortunately plagues a lot of horror films. And so I must give Bram Stoker's Dracula a gold star. Those two minor nitpicks are not enough to bring down what is undeniably a well-crafted, brilliant film, but what would you expect from Coppola, the same man who gave us the Godfather films and Apocalypse Now? This is a beautiful horror film, if one of the best films of the 90s, and if you're not familiar with Dracula but not brave enough to tackle the older adaptation starring Lugosi, Langella, or Christopher Lee, this is a good place to start.